Okay, thank you, Chris, for asking me to do a topic I've not covered before. Okay, so bear with me. Towards the end of his life, in his reclamation of a Jewish Paul, Jacob Taubes not unreasonably claimed that, quote, there is a literary corpus about Jesus, a nice guy, about the rabbi in Galilee, and about the Sermon on the Mount. It's all in the Talmud and so on. A sort of pride in this son of Israel. But when it comes to Paul, that's a borderline that's hard to cross. Things were not always so in the case of Jesus. And what Taubes says of Paul might apply to what the Rabbinic literature, or certain strands of Rabbinic literature, think about Jesus. Rabbinic literature does not, however, contain very much material on Jesus. Some of it is even disputed whether it's Jesus at all. When we recall the sheer volume of Rabbinic texts, vast obviously, it's clear that the figure of Jesus is presented as little more than a minor footnote, so to speak. However, when he is presented, it's clear that he is the foil for what are assumed to be vital issues about rabbinic constructions of Jewish identity and apostasy, as well as some gendered understandings of Jesus, assuming it's Jesus being discussed. Peter Schaeffer's detailed and impressive work has also suggested that the rabbinic Jesus is presented as a kind of counter-gospel narrative. While some of the details presented by Schaeffer may be disputed, and some are, he also does point out that they are speculative. I think the general idea of a counter-gospel is overwhelmingly clear. Jesus' birth, life, death and resurrection are debunked and explained in an alternative way. Yet this counter-narrative is explained in a way that not only mocks implied alternative claims, but simultaneously reinforces the identity constructions of the writers, as is so often the case in polemic satire and mocking. I want to look at such issues with reference to discussions of Jesus' birth, teaching, death and afterlife, a kind of rabbinic life of Jesus. Partly due to time constraints, I will largely avoid the passages which might refer to Christian practices and those which perhaps refer to the invoking of the name of Jesus for magical purposes, although they often are lurking in the background. The circumstances around Jesus' birth are, it's been suggested, to be found in related rabbinic traditions, or rather identified, so the argument goes, with the figure of Ben Stada or Ben Padira. The various rabbinic traditions in the Mishnah Tosefta, Palestinian Talmud and Babylonian Talmud are based on Mishnah Shabbat 12:4, and it's about writing and the Sabbath, including whether writing on the body counts or not as work, and the example is given of one Ben Satra who had writing on his body. According to the Palestinian Talmud, there is a further explanation of why marking the body on the Sabbath is not permitted. Eliezer suggests, did not Ben Stada bring forth witchcraft from Egypt by means of scratches or tattoos upon his flesh? But the use of Ben Stada in any kind of halakhic judgment is dismissed because he is so off the rails that his examples count for nothing in establishing rabbinic laws. The Babylonian Talmud in Shabbat 104b gives us more detail on why this person should not be trusted, though the textual transmission is a little complex and censorship is an issue. Now I quote from Sanhedrin, "Was he, the son of Stata, not really the son of Pandira? Said Rav Hista, the husband was Stada and the lover was Pandira, but was not the husband Papos ben Yehuda, and rather his mother Stada? His mother, simply Miriam, the woman who let her hair grow long." This is what they say about her. This is one turned away and was implied unfaithful to her husband. End quote. In this counter-reading, what looks like a counter-reading of the virgin birth, the Babylonian Talmud obviously puts a strong emphasis on the mother as adulteress, who had a husband and a man on the side, Pandora. Even if the alternative account of the fathers shares the gendered assumptions about the mother's sexual activities. Stada is alternatively assumed, there's a play on words here, as one who is unfaithful, one who deviates from Sata, Samek Te He root. The problematic long uncovered hair is part of a long tradition which constructs the kind of presumed unchaste wife who should be divorced, it's common enough, and not the way a Jewish woman ought to behave. In terms of the son, this means, of course, that he was illegitimate, Ramsay. Now, we'll return to divorce laws in relation to Jesus in a couple of times, but the idea that this might be, at whatever level, a counter-gospel, one which undermines most of the big claims Christians made about Jesus, is not unreasonable because of what we know about the famous Celsus tradition, where the story of Jesus' virgin birth is invented. He was born out of wedlock, son of the soldier Panthera, took up magic in Egypt, the sorcerer's country, and returned as a figure who called himself God. It's easy to see why people think this counter-narrative was lurking in the background of Talmudic traditions. And Jesus appears to be labelled as his son in other rabbinic traditions. Moreover, some of these themes turn up in different traditions where Jesus is referenced more specifically, and we'll return to these in due course. But before that, I want to move to the next stage of Jesus' life. In the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 103a, we have a discussion of the nature of evil and the bad son or disciple. And Rav Hister turns up yet again, seems to be a bit of a Jesus expert. I quote, Rav Hister said in the name of Bar Abba, what is meant by this verse? No evil will befall you, no plague will approach your tent. Psalm 91, verse 10. No evil will befall you, that the evil inclination shall have no power over you. No plague will approach your tent, that you will not find your wife doubtful when you return from a journey. Another interpretation, no evil will befall you. Bad dreams and bad thoughts will not frighten you. No plague will approach your tent, that you will not have a son or disciple who publicly spoils his dish, like Jesus, the Nazarene. Go to one translation. The idea of spoiling a dish takes us back to divorce law again, and Schaeffer notes some of this. The famous ruling of Hillel is that a man may divorce his wife if she spoils his food, in Mishnah Gittin 9:10. And Schaeffer goes on to uncover some of the sexual connotations in the Babylonian Talmud passage, as well as some of the innuendo involved in the language of eating food. Use your imaginations. But I think it's important here to stress that, as elsewhere, there's a gendered critique of Jesus, a kind of emasculation, a figure no better than his unchaste mother, with the implication, of course, that rabbinic tradition is assumed to be its manly opposite. It may also be a counter to Jesus' strict teaching on sexual morality found in the Gospels of tradition, perhaps. The tradition here is further connected with Jesus as one of the great historical sinners, and this comes to the fore in other counter-readings of Jesus' death and afterlife. I'll come to that in a minute, but the idea of Jesus as an arch-sinner turns up elsewhere in the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 107. It's a long quote, but I'll read it out. What was the incident with Yehoshua ben Pariah? When King Yanai killed the rabbis, he fled to Alexandria. When there was peace, Shimon ben Shetta sent the following message. From Jerusalem, the holy city, to you, Alexandria in Egypt. O my sister, my husband dwells in your midst, I remain desolate. He arose and went and found himself a certain inn. Say Yehoshua. They paid him great respect. He said, how beautiful is this inn? Struck innkeeper. Ambiguous. One of his disciples, presumed to be Jesus, said, Rabbi, her eyes are narrow. He replied, you wicked student, do you occupy yourself with such a thought? He sounded 400 shofar blasts and excommunicated him. The disciple came before the rabbi several times and said, receive me. But Yehoshua refused to take notice. One day, while he was reciting the Shema, he, the disciple, came again before him. This time, he wanted to receive him and made a sign to him with his hand. But the disciple thought that Yehoshua was again repelling him. The disciple went, set up a brick, and worshipped him. He said to the student, repent. But he, presumed to be Jesus, God to the editor, answered him, thus I have learned from you, whoever sins and causes others to sin is deprived of the power of doing penitence. The master said, Jesus the Nazarene practiced magic and deceived and led Israel astray. Unquote. Now, Well, once again, this disciple is sex-obsessed and comically stupid. For when Yeshua praises the inn, the disciple thinks he's praising the female innkeeper, who the disciple does not rate as a particular beauty. As a sinner, the disciple should repent, but the sin is too much, perhaps with an allusion to the gospel tradition, if your eye causes you to sin, etc. It is notable that the editorial addition about Jesus is in the Babylonian Talmud. He only actually gets identified right at the end, in a saying that's kind of seems slightly out of sync with the rest. It's not in the Palestinian Talmud, and that is significant. Clearly, Jesus is the culmination of the story of master/bad disciple in this Persian setting. But it's notable that this is a polemic against Jesus as a sorcerer who leads Israel astray, and this may well have one eye on magical practices in Persia, including, perhaps especially, Jewish practitioners of what is perceived to be magic, perhaps even the invocation of Jesus' name in such practices. Jesus is the figure being used to police this construction of what a Jew should and should not be, even if a little deconstruction shows how the binary covers alternative identity constructions. Nevertheless, from this rabbinic perspective, it almost logically follows that this Jesus must die. And the trial and death of Jesus is covered in the Babylonian Talmud as well. In Sanhedrin 43a, we have a discussion of the trial of Jesus in a commentary on the death penalty. So it's a commentary on Mishnah, Sanhedrin 6:1. And this is the Mishnah passage. If they find him, the accused, innocent, they discharge him, and if not, he goes forth to be stoned. And a herald goes before him heralding. So-and-so, the son of so-and-so, is going forth to be stoned because he has committed such and such a crime, and so-and-so are his witnesses. Whoever knows anything in his defence may come and state it. And here now is the commentary in the Babylonian Talmud, which expands on the Mishnah, of course, and gives scope for a more careful evaluation of someone who might be put to death, including a seemingly alternative view of the herald going out 40 days before the execution. Abaye said, the herald must also say, on such and such a day and on such and such an hour and in such and such a place the crime was committed. In case there were some who know to the contrary, that they can come forward and prove the original witnesses to be false witnesses, having deliberately given false testimony. And a herald goes forth before him, indeed before him and not before her. However, in contradiction to this, it was taught, on the Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged. And a herald went forth before him 40 days, heralding, Jesus the Nazarene is going forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and seduced Israel to idolatry. Whoever knows anything in his defence may come and state it. But since they did not find anything in his defence, they hanged him on the Sabbath eve, the eve of Passover. Ullah said, do you suppose that Jesus the Nazarene was one for whom a defence could be made? He was someone who instigated Israel to idolatry, concerning whom the merciful God, sometimes merciful God it seems, says, show him no compassion and do not shield him. With Jesus the Nazarene it was different, for he was close to the government. Concerning Jesus, we might say a few more things. We might note the implication of the dating of Jesus' death, which appears to assume the Johannine account. And I think probably the best piece of evidence for Schaeffer's case that the Johannine narrative was the most likely one known in certain contexts. Jesus is again deemed to be problematic because of sorcery and leading Israel astray to idolatry, which means he should receive the penalty of stoning and the hanging of his body, certainly according to the Mishnah passage, according to Mishnah Sanhedrin elsewhere. But what of this 40-day period which seems to contradict the Mishnah? Well, argues Ullah, Jesus was friendly with the authorities, for which we might recall as others have the role of Pilate in the Gospel narrative. And so extra care was needed, and despite the 40-day period, no defence was forthcoming. In other words, this judgment was as accurate as could possibly be, going beyond what the Mishnah suggests, putting the decision for the death penalty beyond reasonable doubt, and that Jesus was a sorcerer and idolater beyond reasonable doubt. But it will probably have not escaped your notice. Well, it probably has after dinner. Probably not escaped your notice the way in which Jesus was put to death. He was stoned and then hanged, however the latter may have been understood. So not just crucified by the Romans. This not only reinforces the view that Jesus' death was carried out by scrupulous legal standards and that Jesus really was a sorcerer and idolater, but that there is a rabbinic view which is happy to accept responsibility for Jesus' death, even though they likewise knew that this would not have been possible by Roman law. They're not unaware of things like that. But then that's the point. In other words, we are happy to claim the righteous execution of a sorcerer and idolater when Romans like Pilate, presumably, lacked the nerve or interest. And we might follow some scholarship on that shows how Roman power is masculinized, whether conquering nations or crucifying criminals, the victims feminized. And the gospel traditions likewise, I think, deal with the problem of potentially emasculated Jesus. Put another way, we might say that these rabbis see themselves as being particularly manly enough to carry out what needs to be done, not the Romans. Jesus in hell. The Babylonian Talmud Gittin has a grotesque take on what happens to Jesus after he dies, namely what happens to him in hell, Sheol, Gehenna, whatever. The story is about three long dead evildoers, the kind of heretics, if you like, and their response to their predicament and their situation. One of these seems to be Jesus, although there is a variant that has the sinners of Israel. I think it's quite interesting that that's the variant. And all these three sinners recognize the significance of Israel in the afterlife, even if they differ in their advice to what people should do now. The context here is Onkelos of the Targum fame on his way to converting to Judaism. And I quote, Onkelos wanted to convert to Judaism. He went and brought up Titus out of his grave by necromancy and asked him, who is important in that world, the world of the dead? Titus answered, Israel. Onkelos answered, well, what about joining them? Titus says, their religious requirements are many and you will not be able to carry them all out. Go and attack them in that world, and you will be on top, as it is written, for adversaries have become the head, meaning whoever harasses Israel becomes the head. Onkelos, what is your punishment in the netherworld? Titus says, what I decreed upon myself, every day my ashes are collected and they pass sentence on me, and I am burned and my ashes are scattered again over the seven seas. Onkelos went and brought up Balaam out of his grave and asked, who is important in that world? Balaam answered, Israel. Onkelos says, what about joining them? Balaam says, you shall not seek their peace nor their prosperity all your days forever. Onkelos, what is your punishment? Balaam, with boiling sea. Onkelos went and brought up Jesus of Nazareth, struck the sinners of Israel out of his grave, or their grave, and asked him or them, who is important in this world? He or they answered, Israel. Onkelos said, what about joining them? Jesus or the sinners of Israel say, seek their welfare and seek not their harm. Whoever touches them is as though he touches the apple of his eye. What is your punishment? Jesus, the sinners of Israel say, with boiling excrement. For the Master has said, whoever mocks the words of the sages is punished with boiling excrement. Come and see the difference between the sinners of Israel and the prophets of the Gentile nations. You've been warned. Now, Titus is obviously punished for destroying the temple and Balaam for attempting to curse Israel. Jesus or the sinners of Israel for mocking the words of the sages. Jesus or the sinners of Israel are different from Titus and Balaam in giving positive advice, and Jesus or the sinners give positive advice for conversion. Yet Jesus struck sinners are still getting the punishment they deserve. But why? Why boiling shit? It's not entirely clear from the text why mocking the words of the sages deserves this punishment. Schaeffer speculates that there is more counter-gospel material here, possibly turning Jesus' words on defilement and food entering the mouth and into the sewer, Mark 7:17-20, as well, he argues, as Johannine views on eating Jesus' body. Schaeffer is openly speculative about this, and I don't see how that can be anything more than speculation. So in the same spirit, I want to speculate more and suggest that there is further emasculation of Jesus here, as there is arguably with the fate of Balaam boiling in semen. Here again, we can turn to a not always clear rabbinic tradition about divorce, which of course underpins other constructions about the rabbinic Jesus. Now, it's commonly argued that Jewish women could not divorce their husbands. Now, this is not strictly true, as there is some evidence that elite women were able to do so, at least according to sources from the 1st and 2nd century, even if figures like Josephus did not approve. In rabbinic literature, we get the idea of women being able to petition for a divorce. Not quite the same as being able to offer a bill of divorce, so petition the rabbis for a divorce. Now, these successful petitions will typically involve sex at some level, or at least related by implication, namely the not particularly pleasing husband. In some ways, we find it's a kind of gender reversal of Akiba's famous argument that a man can divorce a wife if a fairer woman is found. A woman can petition for a divorce if a husband has a particularly unpleasant job, perhaps making him off-putting and less liable to be useful for procreation purposes, and different types of physical issues which are likewise problematic for the wife. And this includes one poor hypothetical soul who is a particular reference, and this is from Mishnah Ketuvim. A man who suffers blemishes, they do not force him to put her away, said Simeon ben Gamaliel, about Gamaliel. Under what circumstances? In the case of small blemishes. But in the case of major blemishes, they do force him to put her away. And these are the ones whom they forced to put her away. He who is afflicted with boils, and who collects dog excrement, or a coppersmith, or a tanner. Whether these issues were present before they were married, or whether after they're married, they made their appearance. Your life's really got to that level where that's your job. Well, at least I've got my family. Hi, honey, I'm home. There's a rabbinic court waiting for you. Okay. If this sort of thinking has relevance to our rabbinic Jesus, then we have someone who could be well and truly petitioned for divorce in the case of Jesus and ultimately emasculated. Nevertheless, it is interesting that Jesus can be seen as giving positive advice in our Babylonian Talmud tradition. He's still an insider of sorts, and this isn't now about policing the boundaries of apostasy. The infamous Rabbi Eliezer may push the boundaries with his idiosyncratic halakhic views, but Jesus goes that step further. And the interchangeability of Jesus and the sinners of Israel is also notable in this respect. If we go through all the occurrences of the related terms for sinners in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek and so on, from the Hebrew Bible through to the Babylonian Talmud, the term, Reshaim and related terms, is very stable. It regularly implies someone perceived to be a lawbreaker, beyond the covenant, powerful, oppressor of Israel, and so on. The opposite of what a law-observant true Israelite should be. The exact opposite of the righteous, another technical term, as numerous texts make absolutely clear. Rabbinic literature gives various explanations, often in comically grotesque stories, and it can be narrowed down to people who the idea of a sinner can be narrowed down to people who latch on to lenient rulings of Shammai or Hillel. Arch sinners include Balaam, notably, and there is a regular theme of punishment awaiting sinners. And this is where our rabbinic tradition, or at least variant tradition, locates Jesus. We might speculate too that there is a counter-reading of Jesus and the sinners in the Synoptics, where he comes under criticism from the proto-rabbis, if you like, i.e. the Pharisees. There is some evidence that Jesus' association with sinners was a problem too for the first followers of Jesus or Christians, notably the downplaying of such an association in John's Gospel. There was a long Jewish tradition of the malignant influence of sinners, and Sirach sums up what would be the standard view by the time of rabbinic literature. Who pities a snake charmer when he is bitten, or all those who go near wild animals? So no one pities a person who associates with a sinner and becomes involved in other people's sins. Jesus now epitomizes for the rabbis Sirach's snake and wild animals. Okay, now, a little early, never mind. Schaeffer may have pushed the details of a counter-gospel a little too hard in terms of knowledge of specific gospel passages, but nevertheless, the rabbinic Jesus, particularly the Babylonian rabbinic tradition, is a kind of photo-negative of the grand narrative of the Gospels. Jesus was not born of a virgin, was not morally upright. He did not have the masculine strength of sexual control. His power did not come from God, and he was not killed by the Romans, and he was not gloriously resurrected. He was a mamzer with an unchaste mother, effeminate, sex-obsessed, untrustworthy, sorcerer, idolater, sinner beyond the law, as understood by rabbinic tradition, who was deserving of death, and the rabbis were prepared to do it. It is striking, as others point out, that the explicit material is Babylonian, and this is no surprise, as there is a safe distance from first Roman Christian power, a luxury the Palestinian tradition didn't have, and so the language is more coded, and the polemic a little more muted. But Jesus is always remembered as one of us, so to speak, and is a classic example of social anxieties, of the anarchic impulses covered up by social order in gendered language. It also implies that there is, whether an unconscious anxiety, or in reality, or a bit of both, that Jewish identity, like any identity, is not fixed, and there are always different ways of constructing Jewishness, and constructing Jewishness, of course, in relation to Jesus. And if we were to include magic in a future discussion, we can see that the different constructions of boundaries between Judaism, Christianity, and paganism can get very blurry. So, beyond kept the time.